A Scottish soldier who wandered far away and soldiered far away. There was none bolder with good broad shoulder. He'd fought in many a fray and fought and won. He'd seen the glory, he'd told the story of battles glorious and deeds victorious. But now he's sighing, his heart is crying to leave those green hills of Tyrol, because those green hills are not Highland hills or the Island hills. They're not Mylands hills, and fair as these green foreign hills may be, they are not the hills of home.
Sir Winston Churchill once remarked to his officers, "Although an Englishman, it was in Scotland that I found the three best things in my life: my wife, my constituency, and my regiment." Churchill proudly served in the Royal Scots Fusiliers during the First World War, after resigning over the Gallipoli failure, where he commanded the 6th Battalion on the Western Front. But the regiment is indeed far older and is among the oldest in the British Army, founded in 1678 as the Earl of Mar's Regiment of Foot. The Royal Scots Fusiliers were among many British regiments termed as Fusiliers, alongside the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, and others. The term Fusilier comes from the type of musket they carried known as a fusil, which in turn derives from the Old French fusil, meaning a piece of flint. The term was first used by the French army in 1670, who raised the Fusilier du Roi. Whilst many regiments in the British Army were raised as Fusiliers, some were later given the title in the 19th century with no relation to the weaponry. Often, the designation Fusilier was used to denote a certain degree of eliteness for the regiment, setting them apart from regular infantry regiments. This distinction gave the Royal Scots Fusiliers a unique uniform, not only within the British Army as a whole, but even amongst Scottish regiments. Whilst wearing the usual scarlet tunic as a lowland unit, they wore green hunting Erskine tartan trews, and from 1865 onward wore a black raccoon skin cap. However, officers donned a taller bearskin akin to that in the Foot Guards. On that was worn a white hackle, which is still on the tam o' shanter of the Royal Scots Fusiliers, descendant unit 2nd Battalion Royal Regiment of Scotland, and the cap badge was a flaming grenade with a royal coat of arms engraved. Raised amidst the various religious struggles of the late 1600s, the regiment was known as the Earl of Mar's Regiment of Foot. Formed in 1678, it was rather common in the day, as we shall discover many times in the series, for regiments to be named after their colonels. This was for a number of reasons, not least since it was their regiment and often raised partially at their expense, but also avoided connotations of a single centralised army, which following the Wars of the Three Kingdoms was viewed with immense suspicion. The regiment's first main action was at Bothwell Bridge in 1679, and shortly afterwards the Argyll's Rising of 1686. The regiment was shipped south to London for the invasion of William III in 1688, but very little fighting ensued in what later became known as the Glorious Revolution, and the regiment's colonel, Thomas Buchan, a Scottish Catholic, followed James VII and II into exile in France, being replaced by Francis Fergus of Farrell, the regiment itself subsequently becoming O'Farrell's regiment. Under O'Farrell, the regiment went to Flanders in the 9 Years' War and fought in major battles of the campaign, but were eventually forced to surrender to the French at Deinze. They later returned to Scotland in 1697 after the Treaty of Ryswick. It was around the time that the regiment becomes designated the Fusiliers, appearing on the army list as O'Farrell's Fusiliers in 1691. Here begins our first regimental story, the Battle of Blenheim. As fate would have it, the regiment were incorporated into the army of one of its most famous members' ancestors, the Duke of Marlborough, John Churchill. Blenheim rests among Waterloo, Trafalgar and Agincourt as one of the greatest victories of Britons, not only in history but against our old foe, France. The regiment, now known as the Scots Fusiliers, under Viscount Mordaunt, played a vital role in the battle, partaking in furious but well-disciplined assault on the village itself, suffering many casualties. The 13th of August saw well over 100,000 soldiers from across Europe face off in Bavaria outside Hochstedt. The Scots Fusiliers' moment came at 12:30 p.m. when the Duke of Marlborough ordered an assault on Blenheim itself. The regiment, alongside other great and glorious regiments of the soon-to-be British Army, including the 1st Foot Guards and the Welsh Fusiliers under Brigadier General Rowe, advanced under very heavy French fire. Rowe had given the order that only once his sword had touched the enemy palisades were the soldiers to return fire. Otherwise, the advance would be slowed, and not only would the momentum be lost, but even further casualties sustained. The brigade obeyed his command and with exemplary discipline marched forwards, closing within 30 yards, where Rowe rushed forward to strike the palisades where the French unleashed a devastating musket volley, killing the commander and cutting down a huge portion of the assaulting force. But the troops, the Scots Fusiliers among them, surged forward over the bodies of their fallen comrades. Sadly, in the face of strong French defences and volley after close-ranged volley, the brigade is forced back. The loss to the Fusiliers are awful, and their commander Viscount Mordaunt lost his arm in fighting. Though a defeat for the regiment in face of resolute defenders, the action is a testament to iron-like discipline and fierce courage of the soldiers of the day to advance in good order over open ground before taking the fight to the enemy with bayonet and sword. The rest of the war went somewhat better for the regiment, seeing action at Ramillies, Oudenarde, the capture of Lille, and the Battle of Plaquet, where they lost another commander, Colonel Sampson Delallo. In 1713, the regiment was awarded the title of Royal, and in the spirit of the new union between England and Scotland was named the 21st Royal North British Fusiliers, and fought at Sheriffmuir in 1715. During the Jacobite Rising under the 6th Earl of Mar, the son of the regiment's founder. However, he was removed owing to Jacobite sympathies and replaced with George Macartney, a loyalist Whig. During the War of the Austrian Succession, the regiment returned to the continent, fighting at the famous Battle of Dettingen and Fontenoy before returning to Scotland to put down the Jacobite Rising in 1745. The Fusiliers were one of the regiments under the Duke of Cumberland to finally bring an end to the campaign of Bonnie Prince Charlie at the bloody Battle of Culloden, which saw the final great stand of the Highland clans and marked the sad end of organic Highland culture. From here onwards, the regiment saw little action, mostly partaking in garrison duty overseas in Gibraltar, the West Indies, and Canada, until American Revolution in 1777. Here they fought at the siege of Fort Ticonderoga in New York, and then during the Napoleonic Wars took part in a failed siege of Bergen-op-Zoom in 1814, before returning to the Americas to fight at the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. In 1854, the regiment departed Britain under Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Haynes for the Crimea to fight against the Russian Empire, alongside the French and the Turks, with the intention of destroying the Russian naval port of Sevastopol. Now begins the second story of our regiment, the Battle of Inkerman. On the 5th of November, due to French and British commanders failing to agree on how to exploit their victory at the Battle of Alma, which had opened the way for their advance on Sevastopol, the Russians launched a counterattack on the Allied lines. Under the cover of darkness, some 40,000 Russians got into position to assault a British position known as Home Hill, defended by just under 3,000 men of the 2nd Division. The pass was narrow, and so the Russians could not bring their full force to bear against the British defenders. Initially, the fog aided the Russians, allowing them to maneuver without being seen. Amongst these pickets were our Fusiliers, who now began to engage the massive Russian advance, which was in waves, the first being around 6,300 men, with 9,000 in reserve. The division commander, Major General Pennefather, was a highly aggressive officer, and not being aware that he was facing a vastly superior force, disregarded a previous plan to withdraw back, and instead ordered his 2,700 men to attack. In doing so, they were launching a head-on assault against 15,300 Russian soldiers and advancing towards them. Owing to both the bottleneck created by the hills and the superior Enfield rifles, the Russians were pushed back all the way to their artillery positions at bayonet point by the British soldiers, who descended upon them like lions. Still unaware of the scale of the force they faced due to fog. Now, the fog ailed the Russians, as their commander could not see the extent to which he had outnumbered the British and how desperate their position was. Had he ordered his reserves to counterattack, they would have been able to halt the British. Indeed, the Russian commander was killed by the accurate and sweeping fire of the British infantry, as was his replacement and the replacement after that. Eventually, a Russian counterattack was launched on Home Hill, where the initial defenders at first withdrew, but Pennefather now ordered the Royal North British Fusiliers to assault up the hill and retake the positions. In horrific close-quarter combat, the Fusiliers alongside the 63rd West Suffolk Regiment and the Rifle Brigade wrestled to control for the Home Hill, eventually seeing them off. For the rest of the day, the Fusiliers, with the rest of the 2,000 men, saw off repeated assaults by 7,000 Russians, holding their ground in the face of overwhelming odds. In 1877, the regiment had the distinction of Scots once more returned, and it became the 21st Royal Scots Fusiliers Regiment of Foot, and was based out of Churchill Barracks in Ayr. Under the Cardwell reforms of 1881, it became simply the Royal Scots Fusiliers, and was the county regiment of Ayrshire, Dumfriesshire, Kirkcudbrightshire, Roxburghshire, Selkirkshire, and Wigtownshire, essentially becoming the infantry regiment of South West Scotland. It was at this point where they were officially designated a Lowland regiment and adopted the trews in their uniform. The regiment was sent into action for the Boer War, fighting at Tugela Heights and Krugersdorp, where at latter Captain Hugh Trenchard, who would go on to be founding father of the Royal Air Force, was seriously wounded. Trenchard had been something of a character in the regiment, botching his first speech to the officers' mess, where young officers are expected to list off the glories of the regiment by simply saying, "I am deeply proud to belong to this regiment," followed by, "I hope one day I shall live to command it." While stationed in India, he set up a polo team for the regiment, which, being regular infantry, did not have one, but after only 6 months it was able to hold its own against cavalry regiments. In the incident he was wounded at, he had led a force of Ayrshire Yeomanry and a Scots Fusiliers to break and pursue a Boer encampment, which was successful, but the Boer rearguard laid an ambush for them. Trenchard was shot in the stomach during the ambush, but his bravery encouraged the men to surge forward and take the fight to the Boers, in close combat, killing and wounding most of them, with only a few managing to escape. 1908 saw the regiment gain 3 reserve battalions, 1 special reserve and 2 territorial. At the outbreak of the Great War, the 2 regular battalions of the Royal Scots Fusiliers were sent to the Western Front. The 1st Battalion, as part of the 3rd Division, landed at Le Havre in August 1914 and fought in the Battle of Mons, Ypres, the Somme, Arras, and at the Hindenburg Line. Towards the end of the war, the 1st Battalion was commanded by Lieutenant Denys Reitz, a former Boer commando who had fought against the British Empire only a few years earlier. Meanwhile, the 2nd Battalion arrived in Zeebrugge as part of the 7th Brigade in October 1914, fighting at Ypres, where it distinguished itself at the Battle of Gelefeld, fighting to almost the last man, as well as fighting at Neufchâtel, Loos, Somme, Arras, and Lys. The 1/4th and 1/5th Battalions were sent to Gallipoli as part of the 52nd Lowland Division in June 1915, but spent the rest of the war on the Western Front, as did the 6th Battalion, which was commanded briefly by the future Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill. At the total of 19 battalions were raised in the regimental traditions of the Royal Scots Fusiliers for the war. 4 Victoria Crosses were awarded, and 5,600 Fusiliers gave their lives for king and country. One of the Victoria Crosses was awarded to a certain Thomas Codwell, a Lanarkshireman from Carluke. He enlisted in the 12th Air and Lanark Battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers and had been sent to the Western Front. As reported in his medal citation published in the London Gazette, Sergeant Codwell was in command of a Lewis gun section tasked with clearing a farmhouse near Oudenarde on the 31st of October 1918, when suddenly they came under heavy enemy fire at close range from a nearby farmhouse. Sergeant Codwell took matters into his own hands and rushed the enemy-held farmhouse, under heavy fire and took the position along with 18 prisoners, single-handed. Caldwell achieved the rank of Company Sergeant Major, and his Victoria Cross is displayed at the Museum of the Royal Highland Fusiliers in Glasgow. The third and final story of our regiment, the Battle of Ypres Camina Canal, takes place in the Second World War, where the regiment's many activated battalions saw action from Madagascar to Normandy, Burma to Italy. The 1st Battalion as part of the 29th Independent Infantry Brigade Group, which saw it deployed to Madagascar to deny its ports to the Japanese before spending the rest of the war in the Asian theatre, fighting in Burma with the British Indian Army. The 2nd Battalion under Lieutenant Clutterbuck arrived in northern France as part of the British Expeditionary Force. The Battle of France had not gone well for the Allied forces, and both the Dutch and Belgian fronts collapsed, and the need for evacuation of the British Army became necessary as the Wehrmacht closed in. After brief skirmishing, they launched a full-on assault on the 27th of May, making inroads through British positions of up to a mile in some cases. The Royal Scots Fusiliers were amongst those units tasked with holding the line alongside fellow West Coast Scots, the Cameronian Scotch Rifles, and the Black Watch Royal Highland Regiment. After their commander issued the order not a foot back, the Fusiliers held their position of the line, and there were even a few counter-offensives. British losses were very heavy, but the rearguard action of the Fusiliers amongst other regiments allowed the best part of the BEF to escape at Dunkirk fairly unscathed. Once again, the Royal Scots Fusiliers had demonstrated unwavering loyalty to the cause and put up a stalwart defence against very undesirable odds. The 2nd Battalion joined their 1st Battalion colleagues at the Battle of Madagascar in 1942, before taking part in the Battle of Sicily, most notably at the Battle of Anzio, which saw very bloody fighting indeed. The 2nd Battalion had a brief stint in Palestine in 1944 before joining the Allied invasion of Germany in 1945. Fewer battalions were needed for the Second World War. Nonetheless, the supplementary battalions of the regiment served mostly in the European theatre, in both the Battle of France at the beginning and for the invasion of Normandy. After a long and illustrious history under the Union Jack, serving far and wide across the world, always bravery and fiercely with resolute discipline, it was decided that the Royal Scots Fusiliers would be no more, and under the backdrop of a 1957 Defence White Paper, which recommended crippling defence cuts to our military, the regiment was amalgamated with the Highland Light Infantry City of Glasgow Regiment to form the Royal Highland Fusiliers, Princess Margaret's own Glasgow and Ayrshire Regiment in 1959, combining at a ceremony in Edinburgh's Redford Barracks. The history of the Royal Highland Fusiliers, which includes deployments to Aden, Cyprus, multiple Northern Ireland tours, Gulf War, Bosnia, Kosovo, and Iraq, will be covered in future video, but on the 28th of March 2006, along with every other infantry regiment in Scotland, was merged into one multi-battalion Royal Regiment of Scotland, regardless of Lowland or Highland traditions. Its heritage is preserved by the 2nd Battalion Royal Regiment of Scotland, where it continues to serve with distinction and courage. I hope you enjoyed the first part of this series on the Scottish regiments, and there will be many to come. Next week will be a video on the infamous Gordon Highlanders. Please like, share and subscribe, and leave any feedback in the comments.